Buenas noches a todos, me llamo Anthony Stevens Acevedo, soy director auxiliar del Instituto de Estudios Dominicanos. Les damos las gracias a todos por estar aquí. Bienvenidos a City College, bienvenidos a Shepherd Hall, este gran edificio histórico de City College, y bienvenidos a este salón de concierto número 95 de aquí de nuestro campus. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Dr. Ramona Hernandez, our director of our institute, our dear director, who will introduce you the very special guests that we are having tonight at this second delivery of the roundtable discussion series on U.S., Latin American, and Caribbean affairs. Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, please, and enjoy the event. Thank you.
My task, buenas noches, bienvenido, muchísimas gracias. My task is to introduce the president. But before I do that, I have to begin with something that I never do, and I fail miserably to do, and that is thanking my staff for always being there, particularly Professor Aponte and Anthony Stevens, who was here, always available. Not only that, they are members of the directorship of the Institute, but they're also my friends. Jessie Perez is the archivist, and she's the person that organizes all of the details that have to do with having you here. Thank you, Jessie. Gracie, Ruth, Sophia, Matthew, Ashley. These are the young members of the Institute, and without them, I couldn't be here. So I began, thank you, muchas gracias. And I'm glad that Anthony did what he did, because I was in the middle of a talk in Illinois and we had to change room. So there are people who are going to another room as we speak, and the timing was also confused, and I apologize for that. And this is why we wanted to make room on the sides just in case they find this place at some point. I want to thank the people in facility for helping us to get this room really, really fast. And let me get now to the business right now. On behalf of the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute, I want to thank our collaborators for tonight's event. Dr. Kevin Foster, Dean of the Colin Powell School for Civil and Global Leadership, Professor Cherry Baber, Chair of the Latin American and Latino Studies Program, Ms. Yamile Eusebio, Director of the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development, and she's sitting right here next to my wonderful president. And also, I also want to thank the Division of Interdisciplinary Studies at the Center for Worker Education, and of course, the United Nations Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Mr. President, I counted 4 events tonight, being held tonight dealing with Latin America, and one in particular dealing with the crisis in Puerto Rico. These events are held within the vicinity of CCNY, and 3 are taking place in university settings. So I thank the audience for choosing to be here and for supporting us. Muchísimas gracias. Se lo agradecemos muchísimo. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Vince Boudreau is currently the interim president of the City College of New York, CUNY's most historic and prestigious campus. In his few months as president, Dr. Boudreau has led the college with grace, distinction, wisdom, but particularly with the kind of courage and sensitivity required today to lead an institution where many of its constituencies are afraid for themselves and for the future of their families. When needed, President Boudreau has taken a stand to protect the rights of those who are vulnerable to the winds of the economically and politically powerful. As the head of CUNY Dominican Studies Institute that represents the legacy and the interests of working class immigrant people, I am grateful to have Dr. Boudreau as the interim president of CCNY. And I am also grateful to the chief of staff, to his chief of staff, Ms. Didi, Moseleski for making it possible for President Boudreau to moderate this distinguished conversation. Señor Presidente.
Thank you. I'll say just this in response to Ramona's kind introduction. It is my great honor to be, for a time, in charge of this historic institution and the wonderful people that work here. I have a couple of responsibilities. One is to introduce our panel. Another is to give you an idea of the format of today's discussion. And the third is, before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge some of the guests that are with us today. We are fortunate to have Ambassador Avila, Dominican Republic's ambassador to the United Nations, with us today. Is Mr. Bonilla here tonight? He was on the guest list. He will, I think, arrive. Mr. Aldrin Bonilla is the Deputy Manhattan Borough President, the first person of Dominican descent ever to hold that office. So when he comes, we will acknowledge him and give him a round of applause. Al Taylor, who I just met earlier today, who used to play football on the lawn in back of City College and graduated from CUNY school, is the assembly member from the 71st District. We are proud to welcome you back to the old stadium. Mario Baez, the Chief Policy and Oversight Coordination Services of the Office of the Secretary General, is here. We're pleased to have you here. Welcome to City College. Dr. Kevin Foster, the chair of the, the dean, acting dean of the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. And we're also honored to have Mr. Benny Lorenzo here, who has done years of service on the board of the Dominican Studies Institute, and we are grateful, sir, for that. Today's speakers. Let me tell you first the format. We are pleased to have Professor Daniel Titelman here to speak. He has distributed ahead of time to our panelists a PowerPoint with his economic analysis, and the PowerPoint is loaded on this computer. I think we won't have you go through the PowerPoint exactly. We'll start right in with questions from our panelists. He will be able to refer to the PowerPoint in answering some of these questions. And we will go forward today in two segments. Congressman Espaillat, who we are incredibly grateful that you're here with us, has a very full schedule and will be leaving sometime around or shortly after 7 o'clock. So we're going to give him the first bite at the apple tonight. So he will ask the first round of questions. He will be followed in a second segment by Professor Marta Bengoa. And if I can ask the three of you to take your seats at the table, I'll tell you all about the three of them. First, Professor Daniel Titelman is the Chief of the Economic Development Division and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean at the United Nations. And he's done work in that office for quite some time. Previous to being the Chief of the Economic Development Division, he was Chief for Financing for Development, and he has a whole string of publications that came out under the auspices of this agency, many of them dealing with questions of financing under globalization, and in particular, questions of economic and social development at a time of globalization. Dr. Marta Bengoa is a professor of economics at the City College of New York, and while I haven't yet received or certified the letter, I do know through the grapevine that she's been recently elected as the new chair of the Department of Economics, and we look forward to her leadership. She's served a variety of positions. She was formerly director of the master's program here, but she's here principally because her writing is in great deal about the relationship between globalization, foreign direct investment, and social and economic conditions inside Latin America. And so we are pleased to have her on our faculty and as a member of this panel. And finally, a man who truly needs no introduction, but I will give him one anyway. Congressman Adriano Espaillat has for over 30 years lived in the neighborhoods around northern Manhattan and City College. He has represented the people of this district with courage and tenacity. He served both as a state senator and a member of the assembly. He was the leader of the Latino Legislative Caucus up in Albany. And he is now fighting the good fight in Washington as a congressman from our district. And I've said this before, but if you want a master class in social justice, then do what I do and follow him on Twitter and pay attention to everything he tweets. Because he will take you to school. So I think what I would like to do is this. Professor Titelman, if I could ask you to come to the podium where you'd have control of your PowerPoint. I will take a seat at the table and we'll ask Congressman Espaillat to kick us off with the questioning. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank President Boudreau for his kind words. He was very generous. In fact, what I do have is Yankee tickets. And so I was pleasantly surprised to go in the internet. I had to pull no strings and got them at a 38% discount in New York City. So I could not give up that opportunity. So I hope that there are many Yankee fans here that will share this with me. But I want to thank also Professor Ramona Hernandez and the Institute and Anthony Stevens Acevedo and our guests here, particularly the students who are here and friends of CUNY and City College. I'm a CUNY graduate, not from City College, from Queens College, but been in the neighborhood for 52 years now. And so I am an uptown guy, and who just happens to be a member of Congress now. And I know that there will be some PowerPoint questions given to Mr. Titelman? Titelman, yes. And I want to also thank the CUNY family for the efforts that have taken place in support of Puerto Rico. I happened to travel to Puerto Rico just after the hurricane. I spent a couple of days there, and I'm preparing to again leave on Thursday to Puerto Rico for 2 days. And I think that we all should pitch in and ensure that Puerto Rico does not become the Katrina of the Caribbean. This is a serious situation in the Caribbean. It could have happened to any other island in the region, and they're in desperate need still, going into almost a month. They're in desperate need of help. I will be going to Puerto Rico to assess the conditions that we've put forward. A 10-point agenda in Washington, including a request for over $20 billion. We approved $5 billion this last week, but in form of a loan. But that money will just go to continue to grease the machinery of government so that teachers and police officers are paid. We really need a full investment in it. Also, a request to suspend the Jones Act. I was happy to see that even Senator McCain this week asked for a complete and permanent elimination of the Jones Act, as well as the matter of the Puerto Rican debt and the financial crisis that preceded the storm and continues to be a heavy load on the Puerto Rican people, including potential forgiveness or moratorium on the payment of the debt while Puerto Rico seeks to lift itself up. Municipalities have paid over $180 million towards the debt, and the municipalities are strapped for money. Most of the funding is going directly to the national government, the governorship, but it's at the municipality level where you have the crisis, including towns in the hills of Puerto Rico that are still in dire need of water and food and are disconnected. So the rebuilding of Puerto Rico should be a Caribbean endeavor. It should have the seal of the Caribbean as a region, and we should all chip in to ensure that it is rebuilt, and that we stay strong as a region, and as well as get help to other islands that were hit hard by the hurricane season. We are in the pathway of disaster. We have many issues that are in common. The crisis of energy, which is very expensive in Puerto Rico, was very expensive in Puerto Rico, spotty in the Dominican Republic, non-existent in Haiti. These are regional demands that must be met as a region. The problems with emergency response. We should develop a protocol, a model to respond to these ongoing hurricane seasons and storms that will undoubtedly continue to hit the region. And so we must develop the best practices possible to address the potential of havoc in any of the Caribbean islands. And so this is a major endeavor. I've asked also the General Accounting Office in DC to conduct and commission a study on the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which has been implemented in the Caribbean Basin, but we must assess the effectiveness of the funding that has been allocated to Caribbean nations to fight drugs and crime. And they've agreed to conduct the assessment, and I expect in a matter of 2 months to have that report in my hands so that we can better assess where to go with that initiative that was proposed to be cut by the administration, but we were successful in gaining bipartisan support. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, we were able to get bipartisan support to continue to provide that funding to the region. And the efforts that we must engage the region also with a better approach to the Caribbean, right? That we have in the past. I think that our nation has turned its head somewhat away from that region, and we have seen the consequences of that neglect. It is important that we again focus in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is called the third border. We have two traditional borders, one with Mexico and one with Canada, but the Caribbean is called our third border. And we have been neglectful, I think, for some time in investing in the development of the human capital. Although in many countries, including the Dominican Republic, the United States continues to be the #1 business partner for the economy. We also send the most tourists to the economy. And of course, we send lots of money through our remittances. But there must be a better relationship between the Dominican government and the United States. I think that there needs to be greater collegiality in the international forum to agree on things that are important for the region and the world, as I think must happen also in the Caribbean as a whole. Because many of the other countries and islands also depend or are receiving great investment from the private sector in the United States. They're also receiving lots of tourists, and many of these islands are, the first column of their economy is tourism. And it continues to be a very active interaction in the private sector that must be strengthened, and that could only happen if we are able to agree on certain things in the political arena. And that has been lacking in the last decade, I would say. I think there has been a distancing politically between that region and the traditional relationship that maybe we had at other times with the United States. So we must work very hard at that and continue to move in that direction. As I said earlier, we will continue to try to get more funding. I spoke to Senator Schumer this morning, and he's agreed to make a push when we move to approve the supplemental budget in a couple of weeks to also include funding for non-U.S. territories that have been wiped out, like the island of Barbuda was wiped out by Hurricane Maria, the northern coast of the Dominican Republic, other important parts of the Caribbean must must get the help that they need. Obviously, this must come through the State Department as opposed to FEMA, which has traditionally helped out the U.S. territories, including Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we're pushing hard for that. We avoided a 37% cut in this area, and as even General Maddox, Mad Dog Maddox said, if you cut diplomacy, then you have to buy more bullets. And so that's the alternative that we have for this scenario that continues to evolve in Washington. I think that I'm very happy that the House Appropriation Committee chose to include the $57 million allocation for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. But again, there is an assault on diplomacy and the funding that the State Department needs to conduct its daily business, both in the Caribbean and across the world. And so we're pushing hard as members of the Foreign Affairs Committee to behave and to act in a bipartisan way. And I must say that that committee has a tradition of enjoying collegiality and a bipartisan approach to problem solving. And we must continue to fight to ensure that that continues. There is also the issue of Cuba and what will happen there. I'm a proponent that we must continue to foster a better relationship with the island of Cuba, that is very much part of our future. And for example, strong tourism in Cuba is a win-win for everybody in the region. More is better. And there's no reason to feel that the progress of Cuba is a zero-sum game that will turn out to be a negative loss for another country or another island in the region. I think that it will benefit tremendous to have that kind of presence there and that kind of interaction in tourism. Cuba must open up, and we must be full partners in that endeavor, while ensuring that human rights are protected, while ensuring that full democracy is restored. But there must be a positive approach to this situation, which breaks away from a half-century embargo that has not worked. So this is important that we continue to go in that direction. I wanted to thank all of you for being here tonight, and to once again tell you that as a region, we must develop a mentality of solidarity that is often written about in our history books, that it comes up every once in a while in our chapters of history. We are plagued by similar problems, whether it is a drought in the region, or the Mediterranean fly in one country or the other, whether it is the high cost of energies, of natural disaster. The Caribbean must strengthen its view as a region in the world that plays a pivotal role in the development of U.S. politics and policy, public policy, because of its geopolitical importance to the United States of America, and particularly to the northeast corridor of the United States. So I thank all of you for allowing me the opportunity to present this brief presentation, and I hope you will continue to contribute to the future reconstruction of Puerto Rico and its people. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the invitation to share and to participate in this great event, and to share personally on behalf of ECLAC the possibility of sharing our analysis and follow-up of the region, and try to suggest some of the answers or key issues that you were asking. The first thing I would just start from what you just said, Congressman, in the sense that we live in a globalized world, and cooperation is a key issue. I mean, the globalization implies that no country by itself will do well. We need to do well globally. We have to collaborate among countries, in this case particularly among Latin American and Caribbean countries, with the US. collaboration is a much win-win solution than non-collaboration schemes. So the first thing I will say is that we need to stick to the multilateral perspective of solution to the problems. We're facing global problems, climate change. We were discussing hurricanes, where that's obviously an effect of what's been happening with climate change, and natural catastrophes are increasing. We have to face them with a multilateral perspective and in a cooperative way. In that sense, I completely agree with the message that if we don't find solutions, or if we stop collaborating, or if we stop, we're going to have to buy more bullets, in the sense that we are not creating the conditions for development. And the best way to avoid problem is through development, economic and social development. And in a globalized world and in a multilateral perspective, we need to collaborate. I just wanted to pick up I thought it was one of your key messages, which we agree completely. From a Latin American and Caribbean perspective, I will separate Caribbean countries because of the hurricanes and the natural catastrophe issues that have been happening in the last month, which created a new problem, particularly in small seas, small Caribbean islands, which basically some of them have been destroyed. And if they haven't been destroyed, their economic capacity has been damaged really strong. So that requires different type of measures. For Latin American perspective, on average, I would say there are 3 or 4 key issues. We are having now sort of like a turning point in the cyclical behavior, in the economic behavior, in the sense that countries are beginning to grow again. On average, we're expecting the region to grow around 1.2% this year, compared to the last 2 years that we have an average constraint in growth. But the cyclical change in the economic behavior hides a lot of structural problems that have to be addressed. So in a way, to sustain growth and to sustain development, Latin American countries are facing very few a lot of structural problems. I'm just going to point out a few so we can start the debate, which basically one of them has to do with, I start with the social issues with inequality. Latin American and the Caribbean region is the most unequal region in the world. If you measure it by the Gini coefficient, or if you measure it by any other type of coefficient, if you take the top 10% of income against the lowest 10% of income, the difference is more than 12 times. I mean, if you use wealth measurements, inequality is even higher. And if you use the income measure, which is the Gini coefficient, which usually economists do use, also we're in the most unequal regions in the world. That creates not only social stress and social problems, but also affects growth negatively. Because this dichotomy between growth and equality, we think is false. I mean, there's a lot of empirical literature that shows it's false. And when you move into more equality and you move into more better distributed societies, growth is strengthened because you have less social problems, and equality is a positive contributor to growth. So one of the structural issues that we have to face in the region is not only the fight against poverty, which the region has done well in the last 30 years, but it's the fight against inequality. I would say poverty and inequality are not the same thing. That's one of the key issues in terms of social issues. And that has to do with a very difficult problem in the region, which is building something we unfortunately destroyed in many countries, which is global public goods in education, in health, in pension system. So rebuild the social network, sometimes it's much harder than to build it the first time. And one of our key problems is that we have to, in many countries, we have to start rebuilding social network, rebuilding again public good in health, public good in pension system, and public good in education. And that's one of a very important challenge because it demands not only public policy initiative, but it puts a lot of pressure on fiscal expenditure. And we are going into a time of fiscal constraints, so there's a trade-off there that we have to figure. I would say that's one of the problems. Another problem is we still have a productive structure and an export structure. I have some numbers, I will show them now, but I will show them later,
that we are still highly concentrated in exporting basically commodities or very low value-added goods. In a world which is globalized, where trade is changing very intensively, where you have countries that are succeeding, countries that have a lot of technology and knowledge inclusion in their export and their productive structure. And one of our basic challenges in terms of economic challenge is how we're going to move into what in ECLAC we call a structural change in a productive sector. So how we move into more value-added activities, and we're able to change our productive area and our export structure. Because we have a problem of highly sophisticated formal and modern sectors in the productive area, which hires, and we have what we call the formal labor market. But we have a strong informal labor market, which is low-quality jobs. By low quality, I mean no social protection, low wages, and low productivity. And that's a challenge we have to change. It's how we move on to more highly technological and knowledge-embodied productive sector, and that will reflect in a stronger productive export structure. Because one of the reasons we are so sensitive to external shocks is because of our productive structure and our export structure. When price of commodity goes up, South America does good. When price of commodity comes down, South America doesn't do good. And that's one of the reasons that is explaining the change in the cyclical behavior of growth. We are having now time of better commodity pricing, and that, of course, affects growth. But we haven't been able to use those good times, we can discuss that later, with changing the productive structure. And it's empirically demonstrated, and a lot of economic literature is pointing out that countries that have a better diversified productive structure can react better to external shocks because they can diversify risk. They have a more diversified portfolio. So one other key issue of Latin American challenges is how we're going to change and adapt what we call the structural change of our productive and export sector. A third area which is very worrisome is the behavior of investment. If you look at the data since 2013, we have what we call an investment contraction. The investment growth rate has been negative for 4 years in a row. And that's very problematic when you're thinking in medium and long-term growth, and when you're thinking in terms of the challenges of changing the productive structure. Okay? So one of the key issues that we have to is how we're going to boost investment in the region if we want to support social issues and also productive changes in the terms of the productive structure. And investment, unfortunately, reflects commodity prices because many countries, the investment rate is basically explained by the investment in extractive sectors. We haven't been able to move in terms of research and development or more high technological sectors. So another key issue is how we're going to deal with the investment dynamics. And that within the investment dynamics, I include public and private investment because public investment is only 20–25% of total investment in Latin America compared to developed countries where public investment has a much bigger share. So we have to boost public and private investment, and that's a problem that we have. I mean, that's one other issue. And also in investment, I include infrastructure investment. We have an infrastructure gap that we have calculated in ECLAC of around 6% of GDP when compared to Asian countries. And that structural gap is a key to explain low productivity, capacity to export. We have problems with ports, I mean, with many roads and things like that. So within the investment, I'm talking about infrastructure capacity, which is, and not only physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, internet, wideband, I mean, all these things that we are lagging behind. And that's particularly problematic in a world that is moving technologically at a speed that we haven't seen before. So if we were getting behind with the Industrial Revolution, you can imagine how behind we're getting with the technological revolution we're living today, where the speed of change is much faster, and we are not adjusting to that. That's another key issue that I will signal. And just to end up with collaboration, one of the problems that the majority, if you take the World Bank indicators, the majority of Latin American countries fell into the middle income category, and the majority fell into what is called the high income middle countries. And that creates a lot of problems because that assumes that we have the capacity to mobilize domestic and external resources to finance development. And that capacity is not necessarily homogeneous among many along the countries of the region. And it's not the same El Salvador in its capacity to mobilize domestic or external resources than Colombia, Brazil, or other countries. So this category and this brand of middle-income countries creates, because we are left out of the concessional lending, we are left out of many export facilities arrangements because of the middle-income category. And that, for many countries, becomes a burden because they are asked to mobilize on their own the financing for development and to raise the funding, and they don't have the capacity, and the international markets do not lend them. And in the case you just mentioned with the hurricanes, if you look at the external debt of the Caribbean, small Caribbean islands, speaking island, the debt burden is around, on average, 100% of GDP. All the empirical analysis said that for this type of countries, more than 60 or 70% becomes a real ceiling for development. But the debt accumulation doesn't reflect macroeconomic mismanagement. The debt accumulation reflects the cost of natural catastrophes. When you lose 50, 60% of your productive capacity, and you have to rebuild it every few years, you have to issue debt to do that. So that's debt that is basically paying the loss of physical capital. And that becomes like a burden and a bicycle issue, that debt is coming up, debt burden and the service of the debt takes a lot of resources that they cannot be used into development, and that becomes a strong constraint. And that's why I agree completely with your words in the sense that cooperation is needed. If we want these countries to develop, we have to alleviate the debt burden, which doesn't reflect mismanagement, which basically reflects the cost of natural catastrophe, natural disasters.
Hey, my thanks to the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute for the invitation and to all the panelists. And thank you, Professor Titelman, for being here. So okay. All right. You hear me now? Okay. So I have a couple of questions. I would like to focus your attention on trade. So the US and some other Western countries are turning into to a more protectionist approach to trade relationships, using fair trade and other claims as an excuse to go back to a mercantilism approach. So in your opinion, how this turning policy is going to affect Latin American countries, unconscious of the heterogeneity within Latin American bloc? Right now, NAFTA is being negotiated in Washington, the fourth round. Mercosur is negotiating a trade agreement with the European Union. So to have some diversion in trade just in case US trade as main trade partner fails. How do you see all these dynamics moving forward and how they are going to affect Latin America?
Well, a very interesting and sensible question, because before I address some of the key issues you mentioned, just let me give you a little bit of history. And Latin American countries, since the 90s on average, but they started in the 80s in some of the countries, what the development bet was export-led growth. That means that a lot of the countries went and opened their economies to the world in terms of export and in imports. And the strategy of growing was basically an export-led growth strategy, which makes sense. We can discuss if the opening strategy was correct. We think that it wasn't in ECLAC, that it had a lot of costs that shouldn't have done. I mean, it was too fast. They didn't take care of small business. They permitted too many entrepreneurial death, to put it some way, in the sense that a lot of the society, a lot of people, and a lot of this productive capacity was lost in this. And the promises of building because of competition did not come along. But anyway, despite that, the debate we could have, but I don't have the time to go into that in terms of the velocity and the way the economies were open, the strategy makes a lot of sense for small open economies, which need global markets and need regional markets. And one of the failures is that regional market is not developing as we want. So when you have a region that opens up to the world with an export-led growth strategy, all this protectionism that is coming around becomes a big problem because it goes against your strategy. And also, you have already paid a lot of costs to support the strategy. So that becomes an issue. But before I take some of these issues, just let me show you some of the numbers that I want to share with you in terms of trade and other. I'm sorry I'm going too fast. I mean, I just want to point out some numbers, and I don't remember exactly. This is the number. This is Latin American and Caribbean export structure compared to the United States, compared to the European Union, Japan, developing Asia, etc. And what you can observe is what I just mentioned it before. The green colors are natural resources or manufactures based on natural resources. Okay? Low-tech manufacture is that sort of like brown, red color, medium-tech and high-tech manufacturing. And you can see that Latin America, between the 90s and the 2016, on average, I mean, we are specialized in natural resources or natural manufactures of natural resources. We aggregate a little value added to natural resources. But basically, that's where we are concentrated, okay? And we haven't done the jump to medium-tech manufacturers or high-tech manufacturers, which is one of the challenges I was mentioning, which if you see what happens with the developing Asia, they did that structural change. And that's one of the things that Latin America has to do. That's why also protectionism becomes a problem. Because if you want to do this structural change, you need markets that are not in your own country. You need global markets. You need global investment. Because protectionism is not only about trade. It's also about foreign direct investment. If I'm an investor, an international investor, and I'm going to put money in one country, it's because I said, if I invest there, I can not only sell in that country, usually Latin American countries are a small market, that's why we're small economies, but I just also interested in the capacity of, from that country, export outside, using the competitive advantage of that country. So when I start with protectionism, I'm not only affecting trade flows, but also I'm affecting foreign direct investment, okay? So that's another channel through which protectionism affects the capacity. So in countries that have to make a technological change in order not to lag behind too much to world trade dynamics. And we have bet for export-led growth strategies. Protectionism is a very bad news. It creates not only problems with the flow of trades, not only through tariffs, because tariffs today do not weigh too much in terms of the trade flows. When you observe world organization today, is through value change organization. I mean, enterprises put their capacity to produce in different countries, and each country produces one part of what is called the value change of the final product. For that strategy, which has been done in the last 20, 25 years, and if you look FDI, it follows that strategy, you need open trade. Because if you start with protectionism, they say, well, I'm not going to put my plant in this country to produce one part of the final product, because then I cannot export it, and a whole value chain thing will be broken. So Latin America was making an effort not only to export, but to engage countries in a more highly technical value chain, okay? And protectionism is not good news for that. Not only through tariff, but through investment. And a lot of the bet many countries were doing will be, I don't know how to put it, but they will be challenged. Of course, protectionism affects the countries of the region in a different intensity and different ways. It's not the same Mexico, which is highly its exports are highly related to the United States, and there is a very specific. So Central America also has a different situation. South America has a different situation compared to Mexico or Central America. And of course, what the region is doing is trying to open up its partners, its trade partners. Today, China is the first or second trade partner for the majority of Latin American countries, which is a good news in the sense that if you have protectionism on one hand, you open up to other markets. What you mentioned, Mercosur is trying to sign an agreement with the European Union to open up markets. So Latin America is opening to other regions, making efforts through trade agreement or through other, or trying to export. China is becoming an increasingly important partner in the region, not only in terms of trade, but in terms of finance and in terms of investment. And that means political influence.
I have a question regarding that. So what do you perceive to be the impact that the accelerating participation of China in the Caribbean and Latin American economies will have on the relationship between those regions and the United States?
Well, up to now, if you look at this number, United States still the main trade partners with Latin America. Okay, so, and even though China is moving very fast, that of course includes Mexico, and if I take Mexico, that chart will change a little bit because Mexico's export, yeah, the role of the United States, I mean, the relative weight of the United States will come down. But you are really opening a very important question, which is starting to really, starting to see in many countries in the region. China is becoming a key player in terms of trade and in terms of financing for many countries. And not only Ecuador or Venezuela, for Argentina, for Colombia, for Peru, through investment and through monetary financing.
The workforce as well.
Okay, and that will start changing, of course, the political arena. We had an initiative of a lot of the CELAC countries, which is this integration scheme in Latin America, are trying to build a common strategy to deal and to negotiate with China. Many countries are trying to change their export, and particularly are beginning to try to export the more manufactured sectors to China. Because at the beginning, China was basically a commodity consumer. And it began by simply demanding commodities, which explain a lot of the super cycle of the commodity we observed in the last 10 years, which started to come down in 2014, 2013. But now China, and then China was not only buying commodity, but investment in commodity production. It did a lot of investment in land, in mining, in oil. And now China is investing in technology, not as much as in other parts of the world, and it's starting to become a key provider. The Infrastructure Asian Bank, the National Development Bank of China, have opened credit lines to Latin America for more than $5 billion to start financing infrastructure. Okay? The BRIC Bank, which China is one of the major contributors, with Brazil, South Africa, Russia, is also going to begin to be a key financing player. So if you start looking at all these changes, of course, it will start changing the geopolitical arena. And that red line will, if I take Mexico, will come down very strongly. But if I start now looking at the possibilities of exporting more goods to China, it will, of course, will start decreasing. And of course, a lot of economic interrelationship is accompanied with political interrelationships. Okay? And it's not for free that China has become the key player for non-protectionism, for open trade, and for globalization. Not only Latin America, in Africa. The same process that you're observing in Latin America within trade with China, investment and finance, is happening in Africa. So that, of course, I think will have, in the multilateral arena, will have impacts, which are starting to build. I mean,
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Congressman Espaillat for his attendance tonight. And is it appropriate to say go Yankees? Probably, right? Professor Bengoa, I wondered if you wanted to
yes,
put
I
your
have
next
one.
question.
Yeah, have more one more question. So, taking on your points and taking on this slide, I do see that promoting a structural change within the bloc and also to promote trade facilitation, financial markets are a key. They are actually the key in the middle that is going to connect all of that, while Latin America is moving from debt financing process, from foreign aid process to actually be able to be funding itself through either financial markets or venture capital houses. What do you think is the role of financial markets right now in the area? And do you think they are going to increase the degree of sophistication? More companies are going public, etc. Can you give us your insights on that?
Of course, that's also a very important issue. Since the 90s, and with the globalization process, which even though we have had a lot of, thanks a lot, a lot of trade globalization, what characterized globalization in the last 20 years is financial globalization. Basically, what you observe is that financial markets are much more widespread, even though trade and countries have opened their trade accounts and that, but it's basically financial globalization. And one of the characteristics of Latin America, particularly during the 90s, was that macroeconomic behavior depended on financial flows. If we were having capital incomes, economies were growing, and capital incomes were linked in many cases to the price of commodities. If the price of commodity goes up, then the country becomes more profitable. So loans and credit from banks were coming in, and countries were growing. Changing the mood, changing whatever variable we want to take, we can discuss that later. We had capital outflows, and countries had to adjust to the new financial conditions, less financing, and they had to adjust. And that's why we observed what was called the debt crisis in Latin America, which was the 80s, which Cepal called the lost decade because of the social and economic costs that adjustment had. But during the 90s, that was basically, we had the 95 crisis, which was called the tango. We have the 97, which was called the tequila. We have the Brazilian crisis, which was called, I mean, at least we have good names for the crisis. But we had a lot of crises which were highly related to the financial flows. In the 2000s, that has changed a little bit, and I'm going to show you some figures. And particularly, it has changed after the subprime crisis. And what we observed after the subprime crisis is that, let me see if I can find fast. Here. No. Here. What we basically observed after the subprime crisis is that bank lending dropped very much and never recovered to the same rates that were before the 2007, 2008. And what you can observe here, the blue line is the bank lending, and the red one is debt issuing, the bond market. And as you said, the bond market has been very active lately. And what we see is that, of course, in the subprime crisis, you see that the bank lending was negative, but it never recovered to the levels that we had before the subprime crisis. That means there's much less bank lending across countries than it used to be. And one of the key sources of debt has been the bond market, the issuing debt, okay? And Latin American countries have been not an exception, and companies, public and private companies, have been issuing debt. And that's one of the problems we're facing now, because how companies, even public companies, are going to serve that debt or will continue to issue that debt is a problematic. And also, it opens an area we don't know too much. We learn how to manage capital inflows and capital outflows on banking lending through capital regulations or through other. But this is a new phenomenon of bond issuing. And we don't know exactly what can happen if the bond market starts moving. I mean, there's a lot of fear in the financial market that we might be seeing a bubble, that the price of stocks are too high, they're the highest level between the 1930s. I think this is the third highest record in terms of the price of the stock market. So there is a lot of doubts of what's going to happen with the financial market, particularly the bond market. And we don't know exactly how the shocks in the bond market will transmit to the region. So that's a very important issue that it can affect the region. But what is also very complicated is that this is basically a study we've been doing, and we have here 7,000 firms in Latin America. Okay, that's the sample we are discussing. And you can see that 2009 is the blue and 2015 is the red one. The jump in the leverage position of big enterprises, okay? And that's an issue. They're over in debt. But the bad part is that while you see that the leverage jump a lot, investment drop. That I was saying that we have a problem with the investment rate. And for these firms, the investment rate dropped on average around 5%, the growth rate, okay? And profitability also dropped. So we might be seeing a balance sheet problem in the key enterprises that explain growth, because small enterprises explain employment in terms that medium and small enterprises are basically an employment source. But big enterprises explain the GDP growth rate. Mm-hmm. So, and this data is basically big enterprises. So we are having and observing an issue of maybe a debt overhang through the bond market, which is a different type of things that we observed in the past, which was the capital sudden stop issues of capital inflows and outflows. So that's why your point is very relevant. And that has to do, and you mentioned something, what's the role of financial markets? And we have been calling a concept that many economists use now, which is financiarization, which is basically, the problem is that the financial markets, if you read Economics 101, financial markets basically have to take savings from some part of the population that saves and move it to productive investment. Financiarization basically means that the financial markets are not doing that. They're taking the savings and they're reinvesting in financial instruments. And that saving is not mobilizing to finance productive investment. And that's the key issue. And all the incentives are for that savings to remain in the financial market, because profitability is a two-digit profitability, while real sector is basically less than, is one-digit profitability. So the key issue is how we're going to move from this financialization, in the sense that financial markets are not moving savings to productive investment, but moving savings to financial investment in highly sophisticated instrument, derivative and all that. And that's why a key issue is what we call financing for development, which is a key element for the Agenda 2030 and for many other things, which is how can we mobilize domestic and external resources to finance social protection and to finance productive investment. And that's something we haven't solved, but we're trying to give some public proposals in terms of public policy of how you start moving into that. But that's, I would say, is a key element that we have to think about financial systems. How we go back to those financial systems that used to mobilize savings to finance productive investment, and not mobilize savings to finance financial investment, which doesn't translate into productive investment necessarily. And that's one example. You have an increase in the leverage in the issuing of debt, and investment drops. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's a problem for Latin America.
I did want to provide opportunity for those of you in the audience to ask questions. We have about 25 minutes left.
Thank you for your insights. You were talking about the Brazilian crisis, the Mexican crisis, and then a lot of economists, well, you know, it was taboo to talk about capital controls, and a lot of economists started talking about that. What do you think about that? How would that change the situation in terms of over-leveraged companies and
Do you want to collect questions or
I don't know.
Maybe
What do you
let's collect the
prefer?
first 3 questions.
Okay.
So, number 2, Anthony.
Yes, my question has to do with what you were describing in terms of difficulty for debt alleviation and more access to lending on the part of these countries that have, from what you described, has been defined as intermediate income countries. My immediate question is, as a citizen, as a person that is part, in this case, of the Dominican community or New York community, what could citizens do to have some debt on these entities or institutions that determine or define or regulate what you were describing? What do we do about this? Do we have a say as citizens on it?
So number 2 and number 3, yes.
Between now and October of 2018, many countries in Latin America, such as Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, will be facing elections. Given the populist movement and the global protectionist movement around the world, do you think these countries will face the same populist uprising within the next few months?
The same what?
The same populist uprising, the protectionist,
Populism?
anti-globalization movement. Do you think these countries will face the same things and how that will affect their economic future?
So why don't we take a pause in the questions and give you a chance to...
Can I ask you a favor?
Yes.
Can I see that I have a
Oh, no, I'm
back
sorry.
problem?
I was actually going to offer. Now that we have a microphone. No, you must, actually, you must stay
Mario
up
will
there.
not let me live, but he sent me to his acupuncture this morning, so
Oh, fantastic. No, please do.
that's why which did a very good job, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry I had to sit down, but.
No.
Related to the first question on capital control. Well, I completely agree. We have been writing in ECLAC and published a lot of papers when it wasn't fashion on the need of capital controls. But today's capital controls are different because as I mentioned, the way the money is moving through countries have changed. So what we need is this idea of, which started after the subprime and has declined, and I think it should rise again, is the idea of management, I mean, more macroeconomic prudential regulation, where capital controls are a key element, but not the only one. And capital controls are not only in terms of the balance of payment or the capital account of the balance of payment, but also within the domestic financial markets. Sometimes if you put good regulation in the domestic financial market, you will stop capital inflow or you will change the behavior of capital inflows and outflows. So I completely agree that capital controls are a very important part of the macroeconomic tool. They have to be used according to the country needs.
It wouldn't reduce investment?
I don't think that it will reduce investment. I think that's what reduces investment. Investment, we are doing a lot of research on investment in Latin America, and investment is highly related to profitability. And if I look countries which are commodity exporters, profitability doesn't depend on the country. Profitability depends on the price of commodities. And what you observe in the investment cycle in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, in many countries is that if the price of commodity goes up, it means that profitability goes up and investment comes in. And investment is not even financed with domestic resources, it's financed with external resources. So putting capital controls or putting even tax on capital outflows, yeah, it will have an impact, will be in the margin. That's my perception.
If it's profitable, they'll invest.
If it is profitable, they will keep investing. If it's not profitable, they will not invest. So putting capital controls, even putting, like many countries are discussing, a royalty, which means a tax on the flows that foreign direct investment takes out of the country, it will not affect. I mean, it will affect, but in the margin, investment. That's the point I want to. And I think that Latin America is losing a lot of resources, which we need for mobilizing, for financing, for development, and for research and investigation and development, not putting those taxes, because it's a very easy way of collecting money. Okay, so we're losing money and allowing tax evasion and tax elusion, which is also a problem in the region. Debt alleviation for middle-income countries. That's a key issue, and in ECLAC we made a proposal for debt alleviation for small Caribbean-speaking English islands, the seats. And the idea of that proposal is basically to realize that the public debt is not a macroeconomic mismanagement issue. And we have to, and we call for debt alleviation to create a resilient fund for financing investment in natural climate change, to finance mitigation and to finance adaptation measures. So the idea is to swap the debt burden for financing flows, not just anything, but investment related to climate change issues for adaptation and mitigation. That's a proposal we built last year. We have, with the Caribbean countries, we've been moving around. But of course, multilateral institutions are not too willing to forgive or to give, to forgive or to alleviate debt, because somebody has to pay for that. And for that, we are talking about global green funds. You have a lot of money which has been raised in these global green funds. But to use that money is very difficult, because countries do not have the capacity to build up the projects, because there's highly technicalities that countries sometimes do not have the institutionality to build up, to present the project. The way those projects are analyzed and evaluated is not clear. So you have a lot of money sitting down without being used. So maybe, and I think that citizens have a lot to do in pressure governments, institutions, to start mobilizing the money they agree to put on for climate change issues. There are like 7 global green funds, which more than $100 billion sitting down that haven't been used for the last 4 or 5 years.
And these multilateral entities that you refer to, are those the same that define the categories in terms of which countries are intermediate?
The World Bank, basically. Oh. I didn't want to mention the elephant in the room, but since you put it there.
Don't ask Germany.
Well, don't ask Germany. But,
the US,
but that's very important, because a key element of financial markets that you mentioned that I forgot to put in my first answer is that a lot of the fiscal policy in the region, if I show you some numbers, you're going to observe that if I look at the, maybe I went too fast, yes. If you look at there, you have the average deficit in the region, which remains pretty stable around 3%. I will not say 3% is nothing, but it's a perfectly, I mean, the US would like to have those figures, right? But, and if you look at the debt dynamics, no, I'm sorry, that's public debt, across public debt as GDP. But I want to show you that fiscal deficit is not the real issue. The real issue is debt, which has been growing quite fast. Well, another issue is that fiscal incomes have been coming down because of commodity prices and low growth. That's basically it. But what I wanted to show you here, let me see if I can find it. Of course. Well, I'll tell you what you should be seeing. It's basically that public debt growth has been increasing. But it's still, on average, around 33, 34% of GDP, which is quite a normal figure. But financial markets punish countries through the investment rates. So when you talk to treasury ministers, and you say, well, but the deficit is more or less manageable, is okay, you can adjust it smoothly in 3 or 4 years, you will be in your target. They say yes, but my problem is that since public debt ratio to GDP is increasing, investment rates will be lower now, and that implies eventually higher financial costs. So financial markets and investment grade is the key element that is leading public fiscal policy in the region. It's not the deficit issue. And the reaction function of many Ministry of Treasury is not to the deficit, which is coming down, but to the evolution of public debt to GDP. And that's another way through which financial markets close the policy space of our countries, because they punish countries where growth, the debt. The highest country in the region, if you had the graph there, is Brazil, around 65%. I mean, you will say that for a developing country that could be a little bit too much, depending on the mix of foreign exchange debt and local currency debt, but Chile is 17%. And investment grade was lower, was downgraded 3 months ago. And then, of course, the public Ministry of Treasury said we have to cut public expenditures because we had a problem with investment grade. And if I take net value, the fiscal sector is it has net assets, because we have two big foreign sovereign funds that have like 15, 16% of GDP in terms of savings. So if you start looking at the financial resources and financial markets, something is not adding up. Countries are being punished because of the growth rate of public debt, which constrains public policy, despite the dynamic of incomes and expenditures, I mean the deficit. And that's also a very important issue that has to be resolved in the macroeconomic debate. Election populisms in the region. My first approach here is I don't understand the definition of populism. I've heard people that say that in a country we're being populist because you want to increase social expenditure. You can be populist, but populism is not increasing public social expenditure in countries that need that. Populism is not saying maybe I could live with a 5% deficit for a few years and finance education and finance healthcare. So the definition of populism, we have to be careful. I'm saying that because I was last week in Washington, where everybody was talking about populism in Latin America. And my first question is, define populism. They say that President Bachelet is a populist government. I don't think that's, I mean, Venezuela is one case, Ecuador is another type of economic strategy, which is quite different. Brazil was a different strategy, Chile, Uruguay, which, I mean, so my first reaction is be careful when you define populism, because it's been used too widely, basically to indicate that countries are spending more than they should in terms of social expenditure. And that's something that has to be argued. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, but I will say that. Effectively, many countries are facing elections in the next few months. In the case of Chile, the probability is the right-wing candidate will win if elections were this Sunday. But the election is still open in the second round because we have to see what happens with the center-left, if they are able to get together or not. But if probability betting, it says that the right-wing candidate Piñera probably will win. Elections in Argentina next week, which are quite important. It seems that Macri will win these elections and the big loser will be Cristina, but that has to be wait and see. At least in this sort of like primary election they had 3 weeks ago, 1 month ago, it was very close in Buenos Aires. But I would say that, no, I don't have the fear of populism in Latin America. What you could see is the wind going to more center-right wing type of government. That will be my appreciation. I wouldn't say that left or center-left are now of populism. So I would say no. The probabilities are higher to the center-right candidates than to, but despite that, be careful when you use the word populism because they're using it too much in the sense to describe too many different situations.
Let's take another group of questions. The next one was down here, and then we had one in back, and then over to this side.
So do you trust if the little and the medium enterprises of the Caribbean get stronger, could be a different
Excuse me?
The PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, it's in the, I mean, I think you can
Do you
distribute
mind
it.
if you just?
No, no, of course I not.
I think
All right. And my question is, thank you. And after the DR CAFTA, for example, Latin America and Dominican Republic, the balance payment, the trade balance is negative to most of the Latin American countries with the United States. Do you have any idea how we can turn this to the other side?
As
We
per
have
policy.
more positive balance to Latin American with the United States. Thank you.
And who is 6 and 7? Yes, okay.
With basically the trend, obviously, that everyone's always talking about expanded growth, right, economic growth. What should the role of government really be? Should it just be strictly regulatory? Should they be much more involved? And the one example that sticks out to me is we're seeing trends where, for example, our current president here is talking about opening up public lands that were previously off limits. You see what's happening in the Amazon, and mentioning the Dominican Republic, Loma Miranda, things like that. Natural resources, public resources, you mentioned them earlier in your talk. What's the role that government should really be employing when you're talking about foreign investment in these countries, and how do we utilize these public resources?
So there are about 10 other hands that were raised, and we have 5 minutes to conclude this. So I think what I'm going to do, with apologies to those of you that didn't get a chance to ask questions.
Take a few more before I...
Well, I think in order to give you a chance to answer the questions adequately, I'm afraid what I'm going to have to do is shut down the queue. I also want to give Dr. Hernandez a moment before we end. So let's cut the questions at that, okay, and ask you to answer.
Well, change the balance of trade, the role of small and medium enterprise, PYMEs. As I was saying, the small and medium enterprises play a very important role in job creation, more than explaining GDP growth, which is basically that. But a key element in the region is how we strengthen small and medium enterprise. They could make a big difference in terms of economic and social behavior. But the problem is that how do we go about not to have small, medium enterprises in the informal market, but to make it formal and to make it in the export sector, so more productive. Because usually small and medium enterprises tend to be a way of dealing with unemployment. People are unemployed, they try to start some small business and try to survive out of that. It's all right. Some people do basically what we call wage substitution. Instead of working and having a wage, they create some small business and try to get the same income as they have their wages. So a key issue is how we're going to strengthen small and medium enterprises in order to be more productive and contribute more to GDP and to the formal market, in the sense that the workers they hire become under social protection. For example, a lot of the people that work in the informal and the small, medium enterprises do not have access to social protection schemes. So they're going to be key players, but we have to change the mentality, and that has not only related to mentality, we have to change the capacity for them to access to finance resources. In Latin America, on average, only 1/3 of households have access to financial markets. We are one of the lowest regions in the world in terms of access to financial markets. Small and medium enterprises, only 30–35% of those have access to productive credits. So we have to change the financial conditions and also the technical support they receive in order to change their mentality, and they will be a key player. But they have to adjust to the new times. Relative to the changing the balance of trade, that's very hard, particularly, well, becoming, with today's US policy, it becomes even harder. I mean, you cannot even talk about changing the sign. That would be not acceptable. But I don't think the problem is changing the sign, because developing countries need to live with deficit. I mean, if you have superávit in terms of your trade account, it means that you are giving to the world more resources than you are receiving from the world. And for a developing country, that doesn't make too much sense sometimes. Basically, what we need is a sustainable deficit that we can finance through time, and then we don't have to adjust in order to if we don't have financing, we have to adjust our growth rate, our real activity, in order to adjust imports to export. So basically, I would say the idea, in my opinion, is not that you have to have a surplus in your trade account, but you have to have an equilibrium, I mean, a deficit that you can sustain along the path. And that requires changing the export structure. Because if you look at the trade balance, imports are highly linked to growth and investment. When we grow, we have to import more because we import a lot of capital goods. Okay, and that's what Espaillat has called the structural problem of the balance of payment, the external constraint. That you grow, while you're growing, your imbalance in terms of trade is growing. So it's not that you have to change the sign, but you have to avoid this imbalance growing too much, because then you will depend on financial flows to help you cut the difference between export and import and finance. And when those financial flows, by any chance, change directions, then you have a problem and you have a crisis. So basically, the idea is how we can grow with a more balanced trade structure, not necessarily a superavid trade structure with a positive sign, but a more balanced. And that requires a change in the structure of our export, and be less dependent on commodities and be able to export more manufacture. Unfortunately, the market we export the most manufacture is regional markets. But regional markets is very volatile in terms that when countries have problems, the first thing they start closing is regional markets. And I will not show you because of time, but it's in the PowerPoint. You have the difference between how much Latin America exports to the regional market, which is around 10–12% of total export. It's not much. If I see the European Union and Europe, 60, 70, or 80% of trade is within the Union. We only export around 10 and 12% of our total export goes to regional markets. Those exports are the more manufactured export, the more value added goes to our regional market. So it's a place where we can learn to add value added to our export. Unfortunately, the size is small and it's highly volatile. When you look at it, and when there's a crisis, the first thing that drops is regional exports, more than the export the region does to other regions or to the United States. So that's a key element. But my point is that we need an equilibrating deficit, not a surplus. And government role. Well, in ECLAC, and I personally believe a lot in the government role in terms of economic development. That means growth, income distribution, and social welfare. Unfortunately, Latin America had what we call the extreme neoliberal approach, where the regional, the government role was basically seen as subsidiary. The government has to go where the market doesn't go. And that began to increase, meaning social protection. We privatize health, we privatize education, we privatize the pension systems in many countries. In terms of productive structure, we privatize anything that moved was privatized. And if it didn't move, it was privatized anyways. Well. But we have to improve the equilibrium. We live in market economies. That means that private sector have a role, but also public sector have a role. And in our perspective, we think that governments and public sector have to have a much more important role that they have had in the past. In market creation, I mean, there's a lot of, if you look at the United States, a lot of the high technology industry started with government and public policies. Government was the main demander of, through army or through other times, of technological change. Internet started in the public sector, and then it was developed by private sector. So we think that the government has to have a much more important role, not only in terms of economics, but also in terms of social protections. And in terms of economic, it has to have a more dynamic role in market creation. I was saying public investment is only 25% of total investment. So private investment is 78 or 80% of total investment. So we need private investment, and we have to create the conditions for market to operate. But we cannot forget the role of government, because it's not only regulating, it's also creating markets, research and development, through public demands and public buying. I mean, there's a lot of instruments. And particularly, and with this I will be finishing, one of the key elements in the debate that will be coming in the future years in the region is public expenditure and public incomes. When I show you the graph, this shows you public income and public expenditure. But in one word, what you will observe is that public incomes are slowing down and public expenditure are increasing. Because we have social demands, we have productive demands. And one way is say, okay, forget it, get in line, and let's talk in the next 10 years. But that's not the political solution the region is today facing. And some call that populism. That's why I was so worried. And basically what I'm observing is a political change where people say, I waited enough. You promised a lot of things, you didn't deliver. Or you either change or start delivering. So you're going to have a lot of pressure in public expenditure and the role of government. And for that to be sustainable, you have to do tax reforms. And tax reforms are not only looking at the amount of tax, the tax burden, it's the amount of tax, of income from taxes you get, but also in the case of Latin America, has to be looking at tax equality in the terms that who has more pays more. We have very regressive tax structures, which basically depend on indirect taxes, not direct taxes. And indirect taxes, like the value-added tax, are very regressive taxes. So one of the challenges for the role of government will be how we're going to finance public policy in the future. Because you cannot issue debt at eternity. So if you're going to have a higher and more strong public presence in the economy and in the social development, you need more incomes. And one of the rules we've been learning in Latin America is that permanent expenditure must be financed by permanent incomes, because you need this equilibrium over time. And that is basically requires change in the tax structure of our region, which are not easy to make. I don't know if you have had the opportunity to participate in a tax reform. They're very difficult. You touch a lot of interest.
We are in the middle.
But that's one of the key challenges related to your question of the role of the government. If we are not able to build strong governments in terms of their income and expenditure capacity, but also in terms of their institutionality. One of the problems that in Latin America, governments tend not to deliver. So the political economy of saying government has to play a better role has to be accompanied with government doing better jobs in terms of institutionality, in terms of delivering. A key issue that is now in our region is corruption. We have had big problems with Odebrecht and other issues, the way we finance politics and many other things. So governments need to strengthen their public opinion, not only their economic capacity, but also the perception that people have on them. So, I mean, so you have to change that culture if you want to strengthen the role of government in society. I mean, it's not just, what I want to say, it's not just a theoretical or an ideological position, but I agree that government have to play a more important role, but you have to build the conditions for that. So government have to deliver. For that, they need resources, but they need more efficiency, more transparency, and other things.
Well, the best kind of talks leave the most number of audience members frustrated that they didn't get a chance to ask a question. So if you're one of the frustrated in the audience, please first accept my apologies and console yourself with the quality of the event that you've just witnessed. Ramona Hernandez would like to wrap up the evening. She's one of the most gracious people you'll ever meet, so I know she'll be thanking many, many people, so I won't preempt her. She won't, however, thank herself, and so it's my job to do that. Ramona, thank you so much for your stewardship and leadership of this fantastic discussion and of the Institute.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias to our distinguished panelists. Daniel, I know you wanted to continue to the conversation, and actually, I have to say this because otherwise I guess I lose my job. Sofia Monegro had a question. She's part of the Dominican Studies Institute and one of the rising stars. Had a question on labor, and I said, no more question. And there is one, Jean had a question on Haiti, and I said, no more questions. So you will have to come back, and I guess, right, to do this. You also had, in the audience, two members of the Dominican business sector that were, I'm sure, very delighted with your talk. And the president mentioned Benny Lorenzo, of course, who's a distinguished businessman, banker in the Dominican community, pero Mariano Diaz está aquí. Gracias, Mariano, for being here. He's a lifetime member of the National Supermarket Association. So, you know, these people were watching carefully what you were saying, because I'm sure that they're expanding to America Latina. They're expanding their businesses to America Latina. Eddie Cuesta, muchas gracias. Thank you for being here. Here he is, the executive director of ODUSA, Dominican USA. He's here. And also Dr. Charles. He's here always supporting the Dominican Studies Institute. He has just retired, President, as a physician, but he's also an activist of the medical field in the Dominican community. I have to say New York. He's one of the founding doctors, I would say, of medicine that have to do with poor and those that are vulnerable in this city. And of course, I have Professor Suna from Hostos. She's here, she's signed, she's in some place here. And I have to thank, let me see if there's anybody else is, hopefully, I'm not missing. I had a long list, but some people have already left. I want to thank all of them for coming. I want to thank you, sister. I don't have your name here. Please stand up. She is always here supporting. Por favor, hermana, párese, ¿no? It's she's a devoted member, devoted audience of everything that we do at the Dominican Studies Institute. Gracias, hermana, for always supporting us. And thank you. Thank you for being here. This is one of the audiences where we have more students. ¿Verdad, profesora? I mean,
I brought all of mine.
Yeah, I mean, students. And these questions, this is why you were having those questions, like, ¿qué pasa aquí, no? Qué bien, no? Thank you for coming. Buenas noches. I think this is it, President, right? Muchas gracias. Thank you for coming.